Sir, you might want to read page 47. Naomi's voice was calm, almost quiet enough to disappear beneath the low hum of the air conditioning. But it landed like a hairline crack across polished glass, subtle, easy to ignore, dangerous if left unseen. Ethan Caldwell didn't look up at first, his pen already poised above the final signature line. Gold nib catching the cold overhead light as if it had done this 1,000 times before, because it had, deals closed, risks taken, people dismissed. I don't pay you to read contracts, he said flatly, eyes still on the paper, voice carrying just enough weight to settle the room into silence. A dozen executives sat frozen around the long glass table, their reflections stretched thin beneath them, none willing to breathe too loudly, none willing to interrupt. Naomi stood at the far end, a slim folder pressed lightly against her side, fingers still, posture straight, the faint scent of lemon cleaner clinging to her sleeve from earlier that morning, a detail no one in that room would ever notice. It's just one clause, she added, softer now, not pleading, not pushing, just placing the truth where it could be picked up if anyone chose to reach for it. Ethan finally glanced up, just enough to meet her eyes for half a second, and in that moment there was no anger, no curiosity, just dismissal, clean and effortless. You're fired. The words came quick, practiced, almost bored, like closing a file that no longer mattered. The silence that followed wasn't loud, but it pressed against the walls, against the glass, against the breath in every chest. Someone shifted in their chair. Another looked down at their tablet, pretending to read. No one spoke. Naomi didn't either. She didn't argue, didn't explain, didn't remind him how many deals she had quietly corrected before they ever reached his desk. She simply nodded once, a small motion, controlled, as if she had expected this ending long before this room did. The overhead lights reflected faintly in her eyes, steady, unshaken, and for a brief second, something about that stillness lingered longer than it should have. Ethan had already moved on, pen touching paper, signature forming in smooth, confident strokes, ink sealing a decision he didn't need to think about twice. Papers slid. Chairs creaked softly. The meeting resumed as if nothing had happened, as if she had already vanished. Naomi placed her badge on the table, the plastic edge making a soft click against the glass, barely audible, but precise. She turned, heels quiet against the floor, each step measured, neither rushed nor delayed, the kind of walk that didn't ask to be noticed, but somehow marked its path anyway. As the door closed behind her, the room seemed to expand again. Conversations picking up in low, controlled tones, tension dissolving into routine. Ethan didn't look back. He didn't need to. Outside the conference room, the hallway stretched long and bright, sunlight spilling through tall windows, warming the marble floor in thin golden lines. Naomi paused for just a second, fingers brushing the edge of the folder she still held, thumb resting on a single page inside, page 47. Where a line of text sat quietly, waiting for someone to understand what it meant. She exhaled once, slow and steady, then kept walking. Back inside, Ethan capped his pen, satisfied. The deal complete, the moment closed. He leaned back slightly, the faint reflection of his own figure staring up at him from the glass table. Sharp, composed, untouchable. No one mentioned her name again. Not in that room. Not that day. And not even when, less than 12 hours later, red and blue lights would begin to flicker against the front entrance of the building, cutting through the morning calm like a question no one had prepared to answer. The hallway swallowed the sound of her footsteps almost immediately, the kind of quiet that belonged to places where decisions were made behind glass, and no one ever looked back at who walked away from them. Naomi kept moving past rows of closed office doors, past framed awards that reflected nothing but polished success, her grip steady on the folder at her side, even as her pulse tapped lightly beneath her wrist. She did not rush. She did not slow down. The elevator at the end of the corridor chimed softly as it opened, empty, waiting, its mirrored walls catching her reflection in fragments as she stepped inside. For a moment, she stood still, watching herself in the reflection, the same neutral expression she had worn in the boardroom, the same quiet composure that people mistook for submission. The door slid shut with a soft seal, and the hum of dissent began, smooth and controlled. Like everything else in this building, Floor numbers lit one by one above the panel, counting down with patient certainty. 27, 26, 25. Naomi exhaled slowly, her shoulders lowering just a fraction, not from defeat, but from release, like setting down a weight no one else knew she had been carrying. Her thumb brushed the edge of the folder again, pausing on that same page, the thin sheet that had caught her attention hours earlier in the copy room when the building had still been half asleep and the only sound was the distant echo of a vacuum cleaner. It had been almost invisible, a clause written in dense legal language, buried deep enough to pass unnoticed by anyone skimming for headlines and signatures. But she had not skimmed. She never did. The elevator reached the lobby with a soft chime, doors sliding open to a wide space of marble and glass, morning light now brighter, sharper, reflecting off the polished floor like a second sky beneath her feet. A few employees moved through the space, some glancing at her, most not, their attention fixed on phones and schedules and meetings that would continue exactly as planned. Naomi walked past the front desk without stopping, placing her badge on the counter in a single smooth motion. The receptionist looked up, surprised, mouth parting slightly as if to ask a question, but Naomi was already moving, already past the threshold where explanations mattered. Outside, the air felt different, cooler, carrying the faint scent of the city waking up, traffic building, voices layering into a distant rhythm. She stepped onto the sidewalk, sunlight warming her face for the first time that morning, and for a brief second she closed her eyes, not in hesitation but in clarity. Behind her, 30 stories of glass reflected the sky, hiding everything that had just happened inside. She could still hear his voice in her mind, flat, final, practiced. "You are fired." She had heard versions of it before in different tones, different rooms, always carrying the same assumption that her place could be erased with a sentence. Her phone buzzed once in her bag, a quiet vibration against the fabric. She did not check it immediately. Instead, she took a few more steps down the block, passing a row of parked cars, the early sun casting long shadows across the pavement, until she reached a bench near the corner. Only then did she open the folder again, just enough to look at the page, the line of text still sitting there exactly as she had left it, unchanged, patient. A clause that shifted responsibility. A clause that would not matter until it mattered completely. She stared at it for a moment longer, then closed the folder and slid it into her bag. Around her, the city moved on without pause, horns in the distance, footsteps passing, conversations blending into noise. Somewhere above, behind layers of glass and certainty, decisions were still being made, signatures still drying, confidence still intact. Naomi stood up again, adjusting the strap of her bag on her shoulder, her expression steady, unreadable, as she stepped back into the flow of the morning. She did not look back at the building. She did not need to. Some consequences did not arrive loudly. Some waited, quiet and precise, until the exact moment they were ready to be seen. Up on the 27th floor, the meeting had already shifted, the tension dissolving into the rhythm of business as if nothing had been interrupted, as if no one had been dismissed. Ethan Caldwell leaned back slightly in his chair, fingers steepled for a brief moment before reaching again for the stack of documents in front of him, his movements precise, efficient, untouched by hesitation. "Where were we?" he said, not as a question but as a reset, and one of the executives cleared his throat, sliding a tablet across the table with a summary of the next agreement waiting for approval. The glass surface reflected their faces in fragmented layers, confidence mirrored back at itself, polished and unchallenged. No one mentioned Naomi. No one needed to. In this room, absence was a form of closure. Ethan flipped to the final pages of the contract, scanning just enough to confirm what he expected to see, numbers aligned, clauses structured, language dense but familiar. His pen returned to his hand with the same ease as before, the gold nib catching the light again as it hovered for a fraction of a second above the signature line. Outside the windows, the city stretched wide and indifferent, traffic moving in slow lines far below, sunlight cutting across buildings in sharp angles that shifted by the minute. Inside, time felt controlled, measured in decisions rather than seconds. "Everything has been reviewed," someone said, voice steady, almost rehearsed. Ethan gave a small nod, not looking up, and signed. The ink flowed smoothly, final, binding. Papers were gathered. Chairs shifted. A quiet sense of completion settled over the table, subtle but present, like the closing of a door that no one intended to reopen. "We will move forward as planned," Ethan added, placing the pen down with a soft, definitive tap against the glass. Around him, heads nodded in agreement, relief flickering briefly in a few expressions before being replaced again by composure. The meeting adjourned in controlled movements, executives standing, collecting devices, exchanging brief, efficient remarks as they filed out of the room. Ethan remained seated for a moment longer, eyes drifting across the surface of the table, catching the faint outline where a badge had rested earlier, a small rectangular space now empty. He did not dwell on it. Instead, he gathered his documents, aligning the edges with careful precision before standing and buttoning his jacket. The hallway outside was brighter now, filled with the steady flow of employees moving between tasks, voices low, purposeful. As he walked, a junior associate stepped aside quickly, offering a polite nod that Ethan acknowledged without slowing his pace. His office waited at the end of the corridor, a large space of glass and dark wood, overlooking the city from a height that reduced everything below to movement without detail. He entered, setting the signed contract on his desk, the pages still perfectly aligned. For a moment, the room was quiet except for the faint hum of the building itself, a constant, almost imperceptible presence. Ethan loosened his cuffs slightly, glancing at the skyline as if confirming that everything remained exactly where it should be. His phone buzzed once on the desk, a short vibration that broke the stillness. He glanced at the screen, a notification from the legal department, routine, expected. He did not open it immediately. Instead, he reached for the contract again, flipping casually through the pages, not searching for anything in particular, just reaffirming what had already been decided. The paper made a soft, rhythmic sound as it moved beneath his fingers. Page after page passed without pause until, almost by chance, the motion slowed. A line caught his eye, not because it stood out, but because something about its phrasing felt slightly off, a subtle shift in tone that did not match the rest of the document. He frowned faintly, eyes narrowing just a fraction as he read it again, more carefully this time. The words were precise, technical, easy to overlook, but they carried a weight that did not belong to the surrounding text. His finger rested lightly on the page, holding it in place. For a brief second, the room felt quieter than before, the hum of the building receding into the background. Ethan exhaled slowly, the confidence that had filled the boardroom just an hour earlier adjusting, not gone, but no longer absolute. He read the line again, and this time, he did not move past it. The line did not look dangerous at first glance. It sat there like every other clause, wrapped in careful language, structured in the same formal tone that filled the rest of the contract. But the more Ethan read it, the more it resisted being dismissed, as if it carried a quiet weight that did not belong. He leaned forward slightly, the leather chair creaking just enough to mark the shift, his finger tracing the sentence again, slower now, breaking it apart piece by piece instead of absorbing it whole. Transfer of liability in the event of post-merger disputes. The words were familiar, standard even, but the phrasing underneath, the condition attached to it, was not. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He flipped back a page, then forward again, scanning the surrounding sections, looking for alignment, for context that would smooth it out, make it harmless. But the more he searched, the more the clause stood alone, precise, intentional. The office felt different now, not quieter, but sharper, as if every sound had been pulled into focus, the faint hum of the ventilation system, the distant echo of footsteps in the hallway, the subtle ticking of the clock on the far wall. Ethan straightened, reaching for his phone this time without hesitation, tapping the screen with controlled urgency. "Get legal in here," he said when the call connected, his tone still even, but no longer casual. "Now." He ended the call before waiting for a response. His gaze returned to the page, reading again, slower still, each word settling into place with a clarity that had not been there before. A clause like this did not appear by accident. It did not slip through unnoticed, unless someone chose not to see it. His mind moved quickly now, retracing the meeting, the voices, the sequence of events, and then it stopped, briefly, on a single moment. "Sir, You might want to read page 47. The memory came back with unexpected precision, not loud, not dramatic, just steady, exactly as it had been delivered. Ethan's grip on the paper tightened slightly. He looked at the page number again. 47. The number sat at the bottom corner, small, unassuming, but now impossible to ignore. A knock came at the door, quick, controlled. Come in. The legal advisor entered with a tablet in hand, posture alert, expression already shifting as he read the room. You needed me? Ethan did not respond immediately. He simply turned the contract around and slid it across the desk, one finger resting on the line in question. Read that. The advisor stepped closer, eyes scanning the text, confidence visible in the way he approached it, the way he expected to confirm rather than question. Seconds passed. Then his expression changed, subtly at first, the slight narrowing of his eyes, the pause in his breathing, the way his shoulders adjusted as he leaned in closer. That clause, he began carefully. It shifts full liability to us if there are any compliance issues after execution. Ethan watched him, saying nothing. The advisor continued, slower now, choosing each word with more caution than before. If something goes wrong, regulatory, financial, anything, we absorb the entire impact. A brief silence followed, heavier than the ones in the boardroom, because this one carried understanding. Ethan leaned back again, but this time the movement was not relaxed. It was measured, contained. And how did that make it into a final draft, he asked. The advisor did not answer immediately. His eyes remained on the page, as if hoping the text might rearrange itself into something less dangerous. It is buried, he said finally, structured to look like a standard protection clause. But it is not. Ethan's gaze shifted past him, toward the glass wall, toward the city beyond it. But he was not seeing the skyline anymore. He was seeing a moment he had dismissed, a voice he had cut off, a warning he had not taken. The room held that realization in silence. No alarms, no raised voices, just the quiet weight of something that had already been set in motion. Ethan looked back at the contract one more time, then closed it slowly, his hand resting on the cover for a second longer than necessary. Somewhere in the back of his mind, the image returned again. Naomi standing still under the cold boardroom lights, not arguing, not insisting, just placing the truth where it could have been seen. He exhaled once, low and controlled. Find out who drafted this, he said. The advisor nodded quickly and stepped out, the door closing behind him with a soft click that echoed longer than it should have. Ethan remained alone in the office, the contract resting on his desk like something no longer neutral. Outside, the city kept moving, unaware. Inside, something had shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but enough that the certainty he had carried all morning no longer sat the same way. And for the first time since the meeting ended, the absence of one voice in that room no longer felt insignificant. The office door remained closed, but the air inside no longer felt contained. It felt stretched, like something invisible had shifted just out of reach. Ethan did not sit this time. He stood by the glass wall, one hand resting lightly against the cool surface, eyes fixed on the city below, but not following anything specific, just holding a point that did not move. His reflection hovered faintly over the skyline, sharp suit, straight posture, a man who had built control into every corner of his life, now standing in a silence that did not obey him the same way. Behind him, the contract sat on the desk, closed but present, its weight no longer measured in paper but in consequence. A soft knock echoed again, followed by the door opening without waiting for a full response. The head of compliance stepped in, tablet in hand, expression tight in a way that did not belong to routine updates. We have a problem, she said, her voice low but firm, the kind of tone that carried urgency without needing volume. Ethan did not turn immediately. Define problem, he replied, calm, but slower than before. She stepped further into the room, tapping her screen once before speaking again. The agreement you signed this morning has already been flagged. There are irregularities in the liability structure. External auditors are asking questions. The words settled into the room. Like fine dust, quiet, unavoidable. Ethan turned now, facing her fully, his gaze steady but sharper, the space between certainty and concern narrowing with every second. How long before this escalates? He asked. She hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, then answered honestly. It already has. There was a preliminary notice sent less than 30 minutes ago. Ethan's jaw tightened slightly, not in panic, but in calculation. Time had moved faster than expected. Or perhaps he had moved too quickly through something that required stillness. His eyes shifted briefly to the desk, to the place where the contract rested, then back to her. Who else knows? He asked. Senior board members have been notified. Legal is reviewing. And, she paused again, choosing her next words with care. There is a request for documentation, internal review records, communications leading up to the signing. The room held that sentence differently. Not as information, but as implication. Ethan understood immediately. Documentation meant accountability. Communication meant traceable decisions. And traceable decisions meant one thing above all else. Someone had seen this before it was signed. His mind moved back again, not to the contract this time, but to the moment before it. A voice, steady, controlled, offering a warning that had not been loud enough to interrupt his certainty. He exhaled slowly, the breath measured, but heavier than before. Give me everything related to that clause, he said, his tone firm again, but no longer effortless. Every draft, every revision, every person who touched it. She nodded quickly, already turning toward the door, but he stopped her with a single word. Wait. She paused, looking back. Ethan's gaze did not shift this time. It stayed fixed, deliberate. Was there any internal note flagged before final review? He asked. The question hung for a second, and in that second, something in her expression changed, not dramatically, but enough to be seen if someone was looking closely. There was an unsent draft in the system, she said carefully. An internal email that was started but never submitted. It referenced a concern about page 47. The room did not move. The air did not shift, but something inside that silence settled into place with quiet precision. Ethan did not respond immediately. He simply nodded once, the motion small, controlled, but carrying more weight than any reaction he had shown all morning. Pull it, he said. She left without another word, the door closing softly behind her, sealing the room again into stillness. Ethan turned back toward the glass, but this time he did not look at the city. He looked at his own reflection, faint, almost transparent against the skyline, and for the first time, it did not look as certain as it had before. Somewhere beyond the building, the day continued, unaware, but inside, the sequence had already begun to unfold. Not with noise, not with chaos, but with the quiet, precise consequences of a moment that had been dismissed too quickly. And in that moment, the absence of one voice was no longer just noticeable. It was defining. The office felt smaller now, not in size but in pressure, as if the walls had shifted inward by an inch no one could measure, and Ethan remained standing where he was. The reflection in the glass no longer something he ignored, but something he studied, searching for the version of himself that had walked into that boardroom hours ago, without hesitation. His phone buzzed again, longer this time, persistent, and when he picked it up, the screen lit with a number he did not ignore. Caldwell, he answered, voice controlled, but no longer effortless. Ethan, we need to talk, the voice on the other end said. One of the board members, older, measured, the kind of voice that did not rise even when urgency was present. I am aware, Ethan replied. A brief silence followed, not empty, but weighted. Compliance flagged the agreement. External auditors are already involved. They want access to internal communications within the next hour. Ethan's gaze shifted toward the desk again, toward the contract, toward the quiet center of everything now unfolding. They will get what they need, he said. Make sure of it, the voice responded, then paused before adding. And Ethan, if there was any prior warning, any internal concern that was ignored, this becomes something else entirely. The call ended without another word. Ethan lowered the phone slowly, his grip tightening just enough to register the tension he had been holding back. Prior warning. The phrase did not echo loudly. It settled, precise, unavoidable. He turned away from the window and moved back toward the desk, each step measured, controlled, as if movement itself required more intention now. The contract remained exactly where he had left it, edges aligned, surface smooth, nothing about it visually reflecting the shift it had created. He opened it again, flipping directly to the page, not searching this time, but confronting. Page 47. The clause sat unchanged, indifferent to when it was read or how it was understood. His eyes moved across the line once more, but now it was not just the wording that held his attention. It was the memory attached to it. A voice that had not raised itself to be heard, but had spoken clearly enough for anyone willing to listen. Sir, you might want to read page 47. Ethan exhaled slowly, the breath controlled but heavier than before, and for a moment, the room seemed to hold that sound longer than it should have. A knock came again, sharper this time, followed by the compliance officer returning with a tablet and a printed document in hand. We pulled the draft, she said, stepping inside and placing the paper carefully on the desk. It was saved but never sent. Ethan did not reach for it immediately. He looked at it first, as if the act of reading it would confirm something he already understood but had not yet fully accepted. Then he picked it up. The email was short. No unnecessary language. No emotion. Just clarity. It outlined the clause, its implications, the risk it posed if signed without revision. It was direct, precise, and at the bottom, unsent, waiting, was a single line that stood out more than the rest. Recommendation: do not proceed until reviewed. Ethan's thumb rested lightly on that line, holding the page steady. The room was quiet again, but this silence felt different from the ones before. It was not the silence of control. It was the silence of realization, unfolding in real time, without interruption. She saw it, he said, not as a question, but as a fact. The compliance officer nodded once. Yes. Another pause, and she tried to flag it. Ethan did not respond immediately. He set the paper down slowly, aligning it with the contract as if the two documents now belonged together, two versions of the same moment, one acted on, one ignored. And I removed the only person who understood it, he said quietly. The words did not carry regret in their tone. Not yet. But they carried weight. Measured. Real. He stepped back. Slightly, the distance between him and the desk no longer comfortable, but necessary. Outside, the city continued without pause. Cars moving, people crossing streets, sunlight shifting across glass and steel. Inside, time had changed its pace. Not faster, not slower, just different. Find her, Ethan said finally, his voice steady again, but no longer detached. The compliance officer hesitated for a fraction of a second, then nodded. I will. She turned to leave, but Ethan added one more thing, quieter this time. Before they make this official. The door closed behind her, and Ethan stood alone once more, the reflection in the glass now slightly misaligned with the man standing in front of it, as if something had shifted just enough to be seen. And for the first time that day, the outcome ahead did not feel like something he could control, only something he would have to face. The city had moved into late morning by the time Naomi reached the far end of the block, the sunlight sharper now, reflecting off windows and car hoods in brief flashes that came and went as she walked. The noise had grown with it, engines idling, crosswalk signals ticking down, conversations overlapping in fragments that meant nothing to anyone outside them. She kept her pace steady, neither fast nor slow, just enough to stay within the rhythm of everything around her without being pulled into it. Her phone buzzed again in her bag, longer this time, followed by another vibration almost immediately after, the kind of repetition that usually meant urgency, but she did not reach for it right away. Instead, she stepped into a small cafe tucked between two office buildings, the bell above the door chiming softly as she entered. The air inside was cooler, quieter, carrying the scent of coffee and something warm from the kitchen, a contrast to the sharp edges of the street outside. A few people sat scattered at small tables, heads down, focused on screens or cups, each in their own space despite sharing the same room. Naomi moved to the counter, ordered without hesitation, her voice calm, measured, the same tone she had carried into every room that morning, then stepped aside to wait. When her drink was ready, she took it with a small nod and chose a seat near the window, setting her bag down carefully beside her. Only then did she reach for her phone. The screen lit with missed calls, unknown numbers, one after another, followed by a single message from a contact she recognized. Compliance office. The message was short. We need to speak with you as soon as possible. Naomi read it once, then again, not because it was unclear, but because of how quickly it had arrived. She glanced out the window, watching the reflection of passing cars slide across the glass, her expression unchanged, but her eyes more focused now, as if aligning pieces of something she had already understood. She set the phone down without replying, her fingers resting lightly against the table, the surface cool beneath her skin. Across the street, a building reflected sunlight in sharp angles, the same building she had just left, its glass facade giving nothing away. She took a slow sip of her coffee, the warmth grounding, familiar, steady. Around her, nothing had shifted. No one knew what had happened upstairs. No one needed to. A man at the next table laughed quietly at something on his screen. A barista called out another order. The world moved in small, ordinary motions that did not pause for decisions made on higher floors. Naomi reached into her bag and pulled out the folder again, opening it just enough to see the page, the line still sitting there exactly as it had been, unchanged by everything now unfolding around it. Her thumb rested briefly on the margin, not tracing the words this time, just acknowledging them, as if confirming something she had already accepted. She closed it again and leaned back slightly in her chair, her gaze drifting to the street, to the movement beyond the glass. Her phone buzzed once more, another message, this time from a different number. Unknown. She did not open it. Instead, she picked up her cup again, finishing the last of her coffee in a slow, deliberate motion, then stood, sliding the phone back into her bag without checking it further. Outside, the light had shifted again, brighter now, casting shorter shadows along the sidewalk. Naomi stepped back into it without hesitation, merging once more into the flow of people moving forward, each step quiet, controlled, carrying her further from the building that was only just beginning to understand what it had lost. Behind her, the missed calls continued, unanswered, stacking one after another, each one arriving just a little too late to change what had already been set in motion. The sunlight followed her down the block, no longer soft, now direct, casting everything into clearer lines, sharper edges, as if the day itself had decided there was no more room for shadows. Naomi walked past a row of storefront windows, her reflection appearing and disappearing in fragments with every step, steady, composed, unchanged from the woman who had stood in that boardroom hours earlier, yet carrying something quieter beneath the surface, something settled rather than shaken. Her phone vibrated again, this time longer, insistent, the sound muffled inside her bag but impossible to ignore entirely. She slowed slightly as she reached a crosswalk, the signal flashing red, a small crowd gathering beside her, strangers shifting their weight, glancing at traffic, each person suspended for a few seconds between where they were and where they were going. Naomi reached into her bag, not hurried, not hesitant, and pulled the phone out. The screen lit instantly. More missed calls. More messages. One new notification at the top, marked urgent. She opened it this time. This is Ethan Caldwell. We need to talk. The message sat there, simple, direct, stripped of the authority that had filled his voice earlier, reduced now to plain text on a screen. Naomi read it once, then again, her expression giving nothing away. Around her, the signal changed, a soft chime indicating it was safe to cross, and the crowd began to move, footsteps overlapping in a steady rhythm across the painted lines of the street. She remained still for half a second longer, just enough to separate herself from the motion around her, then slipped the phone back into her bag without responding. The moment passed as quietly as it had arrived. She stepped forward, joining the flow, her pace matching the others now, neither ahead nor behind, just part of the movement that carried everyone across to the other side. A car idled at the intersection, its engine low, waiting, its driver tapping fingers against the steering wheel in an impatient rhythm that did not reach her. On the opposite sidewalk, the light shifted again, buildings casting shorter shadows, the city tightening into midday. Naomi continued walking, turning onto a quieter street lined with older brick facades, the noise fading slightly, replaced by a more distant hum. She reached a small bus stop and paused there, setting her bag down beside her feet, her posture relaxed but upright, as if she had arrived somewhere she had already chosen long before today. The glass panel behind the bench reflected the street in reverse, passing cars, distant pedestrians, the faint outline of her own figure layered over it all. Her phone buzzed once more. Then again. This time, she did not reach for it. Instead, she looked ahead, her gaze steady, focused on nothing specific, just holding a point in the distance where the street curved out of sight. In another part of the city, 30 floors above the ground, a man stood in a room of glass and consequence, reading words he could no longer ignore. Here, on the sidewalk, there was no urgency in her movements, no sign of the weight that had shifted elsewhere. A bus approached in the distance, its engine growing louder, the number on its front display flickering into clarity as it drew closer. Naomi picked up her bag, stepping forward as it slowed to a stop, the doors opening with a soft mechanical sigh. She boarded without hesitation, dropping a fare into the machine, moving down the aisle with the same measured calm she had carried through every moment that day. The doors closed behind her, sealing the space, and the bus pulled away from the curb, merging back into the flow of traffic. Outside, the street continued, unchanged. Inside, Naomi took a seat by the window, the city sliding past in reflections and light, her phone still silent in her bag, messages waiting, unanswered, each one arriving a little too late to alter the path she had already chosen. The bus moved steadily through the city, its motion smooth but constant, the low vibration beneath the floor traveling up through the seat and into Naomi's frame like a quiet reminder that everything was still in motion, even when it felt suspended. Outside the window, buildings passed in long stretches of glass and brick, reflections sliding across the surface in fleeting layers, one image replacing another before it could fully settle. Inside, the air was cooler, filtered, carrying the faint scent of fabric and metal, the sound of the engine blending with the soft murmur of passengers speaking in low voices or not at all. Naomi sat near the middle, her posture upright but relaxed, one hand resting lightly on her bag, the other still, her gaze directed out the window but not fixed on any one thing. A child a few rows ahead tapped a shoe rhythmically against the floor, the pattern uneven, unintentional, yet persistent. A man across the aisle scrolled through his phone, the blue light reflecting faintly against his face. The driver adjusted the wheel slightly, guiding the bus through a gradual turn, the city shifting angles as they moved deeper into it. Naomi's phone buzzed again from inside her bag, the vibration muted but steady, followed by another just seconds later, then another, a sequence building without pause. She did not reach for it. Instead, her eyes tracked the passing streets, storefronts giving way to quieter residential blocks, trees appearing between buildings, their shadows stretching across sidewalks in thinner lines as the sun climbed higher. The bus slowed at the next stop, brakes releasing a soft hiss as it came to rest. The doors opened, and a few passengers stepped off, replaced by others who climbed aboard, each carrying their own momentum, their own direction, their own reasons for moving forward. Naomi remained still, letting the flow pass around her, unchanged. Somewhere across the city, inside a glass tower that reflected nothing of what was happening within it, time was moving differently, faster, tighter, pulling decisions into sharper focus. Here, on this bus, time stretched, each second marked by the hum of the engine and the shifting light through the windows. Her phone vibrated again, this time longer, insistent. She exhaled slowly, then reached into her bag, pulling it out and looking at the screen without hesitation. More messages, more missed calls, the same name appearing again, repeated, no longer distant. Ethan Caldwell. The newest message sat at the top. Please. The single word stood out, not because of what it said, but because of what it did not carry. No authority, no command, just urgency, stripped down to its simplest form. Naomi held the phone in her hand for a moment, her thumb hovering just above the screen, not pressing, not responding, just acknowledging the shift that had taken place somewhere beyond her reach, but no longer beyond her awareness. The bus began moving again, pulling away from the stop, merging back into traffic with a smooth, controlled motion. Outside, a traffic light changed from red to green, cars moving forward in a synchronized release. Inside, Naomi lowered the phone slowly, placing it back into her bag without replying. Her reflection in the window appeared faintly over the passing city, layered, almost transparent, yet steady. She leaned back slightly in her seat, her eyes softening just a fraction, not with doubt, but with clarity. Whatever was unfolding behind her was no longer something she needed to chase or correct. It was something that had already begun to reveal itself, step by step, consequence by consequence. The bus continued forward, carrying her further from the place where her voice had been dismissed, and closer to something quieter, something more certain, where the value of what she had seen did not depend on whether anyone had listened in time. The bus slowed again, easing into another stop as the city outside shifted into a quieter rhythm, fewer glass towers, more brick, more space between buildings, the noise softening into something less urgent. Naomi remained seated, her gaze steady on the window as the reflection of passing trees flickered across the glass, light breaking into patterns that changed with every second. The engine idled low, a steady hum beneath everything else, and for a moment, the world felt suspended between movement and stillness. Her phone did not vibrate this time. The silence from it felt different, not empty, but full, as if everything that needed to be said had already been sent, waiting somewhere behind her. Across the aisle, the man who had been scrolling earlier paused, glancing briefly out the window before returning to his screen, his attention already shifting away again. A soft chime sounded as the bus doors opened, and a few more passengers stepped off, their footsteps fading quickly onto the sidewalk, each one disappearing into their own direction. Naomi exhaled slowly, her fingers brushing the edge of her bag, grounding herself in something simple, something physical. The driver adjusted the mirror slightly, checking the street behind them, then looked forward again, hands steady on the wheel, waiting for the signal to move. Naomi reached into her bag once more, pulling out the folder, opening it carefully on her lap, the pages catching a thin strip of sunlight that fell across them from the window. Page 47. The line remained exactly as it had been, unchanged by everything now unfolding elsewhere, the words sitting quietly, carrying a consequence that did not need to announce itself to be real. Her eyes moved across it once more, not searching, not analyzing, just confirming what she had already known the moment she first read it. A subtle shift in her expression followed, not a smile, not relief, just a quiet recognition of something complete. The bus began moving again, pulling away from the curb with a smooth motion, merging back into the flow of traffic as the light ahead turned green. Naomi closed the folder and rested it back inside her bag, her hands still afterward, her posture unchanged. Outside, a small park came into view, trees lining the edge, their leaves moving slightly in a breeze that did not reach inside the bus. A few people sat on benches, some alone, some in conversation, their voices lost behind the glass. The simplicity of it all contrasted with the tension building elsewhere, a quiet reminder that not everything unfolded in the same space or at the same pace. Naomi shifted slightly in her seat, her reflection appearing again in the window, layered over the passing scenery, her face calm, steady, present. For a brief moment, her eyes lowered, not to the phone, not to the folder, but to her own hands, resting loosely together, still, controlled, the same hands that had turned that page, that had recognized what others had missed. The bus continued forward, the city unfolding in measured segments, each block passing without interruption. Somewhere far behind her, decisions were being reconsidered, voices raised or lowered in rooms she no longer occupied, consequences taking shape in ways that could not be undone by urgency alone. Here, in this seat, there was no rush, no need to respond to what had already been set in motion. The bus approached another stop, slowing gradually, the familiar hiss of brakes marking the transition. Naomi stood this time before the doors fully opened, her movement smooth, deliberate, stepping into the aisle with quiet confidence. The doors slid open, and she stepped down onto the sidewalk, the air outside warmer now, the light brighter, the space wider. The bus pulled away behind her, continuing on its route without pause, leaving her standing at the edge of a street that curved gently ahead. Naomi adjusted the strap of her bag on her shoulder and began walking again, her pace steady, her direction clear. As the distance between her and everything behind her continued to grow, not with urgency, but with certainty, the street curved gently ahead, quieter than the ones she had left behind, lined with low buildings and patches of shade that softened the midday light. And Naomi walked into it without hesitation, her pace steady, her steps measured, each one carrying her further into a space where the noise of glass towers and urgent voices no longer reached. The air felt different here, warmer, slower, the kind of stillness that did not demand attention but offered it if someone chose to notice. A breeze moved lightly through the trees along the sidewalk, shifting leaves just enough to scatter small patterns of light across the pavement, brief and changing, like reflections that did not stay long enough to be held. Naomi adjusted the strap of her bag once, a simple motion, then let her hand fall back to her side, her posture unchanged, her expression calm, but not distant, present in a way that did not need to prove itself. Behind her, far across the city, inside a building of glass and consequence, movement had become sharper, faster, voices no longer measured in the same controlled tone they had carried earlier that morning. Ethan stood in his office, no longer near the window, no longer still, the contract open again on his desk, pages no longer aligned with the same precision as before. The room held a different kind of energy now, not chaotic, but tightened, every second carrying more weight than the last. The compliance officer had returned, not alone this time, accompanied by legal counsel, both of them speaking in low, focused voices, words overlapping just enough to show urgency, without losing control. "They have confirmed the clause is active," one of them said, tapping the edge of the document lightly, as if grounding the conversation in something tangible. "If this proceeds without amendment, the liability is fully on us." Ethan listened, but his attention did not stay on their words for long. It shifted again and again, back to a moment that now refused to remain in the past. A voice, steady, unshaken, offering a warning that had not asked for attention, only recognition. He exhaled slowly, the breath controlled, but heavier now, carrying something closer to understanding than calculation. "Where is she?" he asked, not raising his voice, but placing the question in the room with enough weight that it redirected everything else. The compliance officer answered quickly this time. "We tracked her exit. She left the building about an hour ago. We are trying to reach her." Ethan's gaze moved briefly to his phone, resting on the desk, the screen dark now, no longer lighting up with new messages, the silence from it sharper than the earlier flood of calls. "Trying is not enough," he said, his tone steady, but no longer detached. "Find her." The legal counsel exchanged a brief glance, then nodded, already moving toward the door, the urgency no longer something they could keep contained in measured speech alone. The door closed behind them, leaving Ethan alone once more, but this time the silence did not feel controlled. It felt exposed, like a space where something important had already passed through and left its absence behind. He looked down at the contract again, his hand resting on the page, fingers still, not tracing, not turning, just holding the place where everything had shifted. Outside his office, footsteps moved faster now, voices lower but more frequent, the building itself carrying a different rhythm, one that no longer matched the certainty it had projected just hours earlier. Across the city, Naomi reached the end of the quiet street and paused briefly at a corner, the light ahead turning red, holding her in place for a moment that felt neither delayed nor rushed. A car passed slowly in front of her, then another, the flow steady, predictable. She stood there, her gaze forward, her expression unchanged, not waiting for anything beyond the signal to change. When it did, she stepped forward without hesitation, crossing into the next block, the sunlight catching briefly along the edge of her profile before shifting away again. She did not look back. She did not need to. Somewhere behind her, realization had already taken hold, unfolding step by step in a space she no longer occupied. And ahead of her, the path remained clear, not because it was easy, but because she had already chosen it before anyone else had realized what it meant. The light at the intersection turned green, but Naomi had already stepped forward a second before the signal fully changed, not out of impatience, but out of certainty, as if she had learned long ago not to wait for permission when the direction was already clear. Her shoes met the pavement in soft, even steps, the sound barely noticeable against the distant hum of the city, yet steady enough to mark her movement through a space that no longer tried to hold her in place. The street ahead opened into a wider avenue, lined with older buildings that carried a quieter kind of permanence, their brick facades worn but solid, windows reflecting sunlight in softer tones than the sharp glass towers behind her. She continued walking, her pace unchanged, her posture calm, her expression neutral but grounded, like someone who had already made peace with a decision long before anyone else realized it mattered. Behind her, far above ground level, the building she had left behind no longer moved in quiet efficiency. Inside, conversations had shifted from measured to urgent, not louder, but tighter, faster, each word carrying more consequence than before. Ethan stood near his desk again, but this time he was not still. He moved once, then again, small controlled motions that did not quite settle, his attention divided between the contract, the open email, and the absence that had begun to define everything in that room. His phone lay in front of him, screen dark, no new messages appearing, the silence from it sharper than the earlier flood of attempts. He reached for it anyway, unlocking it, scrolling through the thread he had already read too many times in too short a span. The last message still sat there, unanswered, unchanged. He typed once, paused, deleted, then tried again, his thumb hovering over the screen as if waiting for something beyond words to guide him. Nothing came. He locked the phone again and set it down with a controlled motion that carried more weight than the gesture required. A knock came at the door, followed by the compliance officer stepping in once more, her expression focused but no longer guarded. "We traced her last known location," she said, holding a tablet in both hands, her voice steady but edged with urgency that no longer needed to be concealed. She boarded a city bus heading north. "We are narrowing down possible stops." Ethan nodded once, his gaze shifting briefly to the window, then back to her. "And the auditors?" he asked. "They are on site," she replied. "They have requested immediate access to internal review records. They are starting with the contract you signed." The room held that sentence differently, not as information, but as confirmation that the line between possibility and consequence had already been crossed. Ethan exhaled slowly, the breath controlled but heavier than before, then stepped back slightly from the desk, creating a distance that did not reduce the weight of what sat on it. "Keep tracking," he said, his voice steady, but no longer detached. "The moment you have a location, I want to know." She nodded and turned to leave, but paused at the door for just a fraction of a second, as if considering something, then chose not to say it, stepping out and closing the door behind her with a soft click that lingered longer than it should have. Ethan remained alone again, but the silence this time was not empty. It was filled with the awareness of a moment that could have been different, a decision that had already moved beyond correction, leaving only response in its wake. Across the city, Naomi reached the end of the avenue and slowed slightly, not because she needed to, but because the space around her had shifted again, opening into a small plaza where the noise softened into something more distant, more diffused. A fountain sat at the center, water moving in a continuous, gentle rhythm that did not demand attention, but offered it quietly to anyone who noticed. She stepped toward it, stopping at the edge, her gaze resting on the surface where light broke into small, shifting reflections. For a moment, she stood still, the movement of the water contrasting with her own stillness, grounding the space around her in something simple and constant. Her phone remained in her bag, silent now, the earlier urgency no longer reaching her in the same way. She did not check it. She did not need to. The world behind her had already begun to unfold on its own terms, each consequence arriving in its own time, independent of whether she chose to engage with it again. She turned slightly, the sunlight catching the edge of her profile, then continued walking, leaving the plaza behind her, her steps quiet, steady, carrying her forward into a space where her value did not need to be recognized to exist, and where the truth she had seen remained unchanged, regardless of when others finally understood it. The afternoon light softened as it stretched across the city, losing its sharp edge and settling into something warmer, something quieter, and Naomi walked through it without changing her pace, her steps still even, her presence still grounded, as if nothing around her needed to rush for her to move forward. The plaza faded behind her, replaced by a long street lined with small businesses, their windows reflecting a slower version of the city, one where conversations lingered and time did not feel compressed into decisions and deadlines. A bell chimed faintly as a shop door opened somewhere behind her, followed by a low murmur of voices that blended into the background as she continued on. Her bag rested securely against her shoulder, the weight familiar, the contents unchanged, yet everything tied to them now unfolding elsewhere with a momentum she no longer needed to follow. Across the city, the building of glass no longer reflected certainty, only activity, movement visible even from the outside as figures passed quickly behind windows, doors opening and closing in shorter intervals, conversations forming and dissolving in rooms that no longer held the same control they had that morning. Inside, Ethan stood near the center of his office, no longer anchored to the desk or the window, but caught between them, as if neither space offered the distance he needed. The contract remained open, the email beside it, both documents now part of the same realization that had settled fully into place. The compliance officer returned again, this time with a different kind of presence, less cautious, more direct. "They are requesting a formal statement," she said, placing the words carefully but without hesitation. "And they have asked specifically whether any internal warning was ignored prior to execution." Ethan did not respond immediately. His gaze shifted once, briefly, toward the email, then back to her, the answer already understood before it was spoken. "Yes," he said finally, his voice steady, but no longer protected by distance. The word did not echo. It settled, quiet and exact. The compliance officer nodded once, not surprised, just acknowledging the shift that had already taken place. "We will need to document that," she replied. Ethan exhaled slowly, then gave a single nod. "Do it," he said. No resistance. No delay. The moment for control had passed. Now there was only response. She turned and left, the door closing behind her, leaving the office in a silence that felt clearer than before, not because it was empty, but because it was no longer pretending to be something else. Ethan stepped closer to the desk again, his hand resting lightly on the edge, his gaze fixed on the page that had changed everything. Page 47. The number sat at the corner, unchanged, unremarkable, yet carrying the weight of a moment he had dismissed too quickly. He closed the contract slowly, aligning the edges with care, not out of habit this time, but out of recognition, as if the act itself marked the end of something he could not reopen the same way again. His phone remained still beside it, no longer lighting up, no longer demanding attention. The urgency now transferred entirely into the space around him. Across the city, Naomi reached the end of the street and paused briefly at another intersection, the light ahead still red, holding her in place for a moment that did not feel like waiting, only a natural pause in movement. A car passed in front of her, then another, their motion steady, predictable. She stood there, her gaze forward, her posture unchanged, the same calm presence she had carried through every moment that day. When the signal shifted, she stepped forward again, crossing into the next block without hesitation, her figure moving through the light in a way that did not ask to be noticed, but could not be ignored by anyone who truly saw. She did not reach for her phone. She did not look back. The distance between her and the building behind her had grown, not just in space, but in meaning, separating what had been dismissed from what remained true regardless of recognition. And somewhere behind her, in a room of glass and consequence, a man stood with the quiet understanding that the person he had removed from that room had been the only one who saw clearly when it mattered most, and that some decisions did not reveal their weight until the moment they could no longer be undone. The light shifted again as the afternoon began to lean toward evening, softening the edges of everything it touched, turning glass into something less reflective and more transparent, as if the city itself was slowly letting go of its sharpness. Naomi continued walking, her pace unchanged, her steps steady, each one grounded in a direction she no longer questioned. The street opened into a quieter neighborhood, the kind where movement slowed naturally, where conversations were not rushed and footsteps did not echo as sharply against the pavement. A dog barked faintly in the distance, followed by the sound of a screen door closing, small details that filled the space without demanding attention. Naomi passed a row of trees, their leaves catching the fading light in gentle patterns, shadows stretching longer now, softer, no longer defined by precision but by presence. Her reflection appeared briefly in a storefront window, then disappeared again as she moved past it, unchanged, composed, carrying the same quiet certainty she had held all day. Across the city, the building of glass no longer held the illusion of control. Inside, the pace had shifted fully, No longer measured, no longer contained, but not chaotic either. Simply real, each action now tied directly to consequence without the buffer of assumption. Ethan stood near his desk once more, but his posture had changed, not rigid, not relaxed, something in between, something that no longer pretended certainty where it did not exist. The compliance officer returned one final time, not with urgency now, but with completion. "They have initiated a formal review," she said, her voice steady, carrying no judgment, only fact. "And they have requested that you be present for questioning tomorrow morning." Ethan nodded once, the motion small, but deliberate. "Understood," he replied. The words came without resistance, without defense, just acceptance of a process that had already begun moving beyond him. She paused for a moment, then added quietly, "We were able to confirm her last stop. She is no longer on the route. We are still trying to locate her." Ethan's gaze shifted briefly, not to the contract this time, not to the phone, but to the space just beyond them, as if measuring something that could no longer be reached by effort alone. "If she reaches out," he said, his voice lower now, more measured, "connect her to me directly." The compliance officer nodded, then turned and left, the door closing behind her with a soft finality that marked the end of something more than just a conversation. The room settled into stillness again, but this time it did not feel empty. It felt honest. Ethan walked slowly to the window, resting one hand lightly against the glass, the cool surface grounding him in a way nothing else in the room could. The city below moved as it always had, traffic flowing, people crossing streets, light shifting across buildings that had seen countless decisions come and go without ever pausing. He stood there for a moment longer, his reflection faint in the glass, no longer sharp, no longer dominant, just present, layered with everything beyond it. Somewhere within that reflection, a realization had settled fully into place, not loud, not dramatic, but complete. He had not lost control in a single moment. He had given it away, one decision at a time, beginning with the one he had dismissed without listening. Across the city, Naomi turned down another street, quieter still, the sound of her footsteps blending into the soft rhythm of the evening beginning to form. The light caught her again for a brief moment, outlining her figure before shifting away, leaving her in a space that did not need to be illuminated to be certain. She did not stop. She did not look back. The distance between her and everything behind her had become more than physical now. It had become final, defined not by how far she had walked, but by what she no longer carried with her. And in that quiet separation, something remained clear, steady, unchanged. The truth she had seen did not need to be defended, did not need to be repeated. It simply existed, waiting for the moment others were ready to face it. The evening settled in slowly, not with a sudden change, but with a quiet shift in color and tone, the sky softening into deeper shades as the last of the sunlight stretched across the edges of buildings and faded into something warmer, something more still. Naomi continued along the street, her steps steady, her presence unchanged, moving through a space that no longer asked anything of her and no longer held anything she needed to answer. The neighborhood around her grew quieter with each block, the distant hum of traffic replaced by softer sounds, a porch light flickering on, a car door closing somewhere down the street, the faint rustle of leaves moving gently in the evening air. She slowed slightly as she approached a small park, not out of hesitation, but because the space invited stillness, the kind that did not interrupt movement, but reshaped it into something more deliberate. She stepped onto the path, gravel shifting softly beneath her shoes, the sound grounding, real, simple. A few benches lined the walkway, some empty, some occupied by figures lost in their own quiet moments, their silhouettes softened by the fading light. Naomi moved past them without drawing attention, her gaze forward, her posture calm, as if she had already arrived at a place within herself that did not depend on where she stood. Across the city, the building of glass stood unchanged in structure, but altered in meaning, its reflections now dimmed by the evening sky, its interior lights beginning to glow, revealing more than they concealed. Inside, Ethan remained in his office, the day having stretched longer than expected, not in hours, but in wait. The contract no longer sat open, the email no longer needed to be reread. Everything that needed to be understood had already settled into place. He stood once more by the window, his reflection faint against the darkening glass, no longer sharp, no longer dominant, just present, layered with the city beyond. His phone rested on the desk behind him, silent now, the earlier urgency replaced by something quieter, something that did not demand action but required acknowledgement. He did not reach for it. Instead, he looked out over the city, the movement below continuing as it always had, people heading home, lights turning on, the day closing in ways that did not pause for individual moments of realization. He exhaled slowly, the breath steady, controlled, but carrying something different now, not tension, not urgency, but acceptance. Not of outcome, not yet, but of truth. Somewhere within that silence, a single understanding remained clear, unshaken by everything that had followed. He had dismissed the one voice that had tried to prevent all of this, not because it was wrong, but because he had chosen not to see it. And that choice, simple in the moment, had reshaped everything that came after. Across the park, Naomi reached a bench near the edge of the path and paused, not sitting, just standing for a moment, her gaze lifting slightly toward the sky as the last light faded into a deeper blue. Her phone remained in her bag, untouched, the messages within it no longer carrying the same urgency they once had. She did not need to read them to know what they said. She did not need to answer them to understand what had changed. The truth had already moved beyond explanation. It had already taken its place. She lowered her gaze again and continued walking, leaving the bench behind, the path stretching forward into the dimming light, her steps quiet, certain, carrying her further into a space where her worth had never depended on recognition, and where what she had seen, what she had known, remained exactly what it had always been, clear, steady, and undeniable. And somewhere behind her, in a room filled with glass and consequence, a man stood with the quiet realization that power had never been in the decision to dismiss someone, but in the humility to listen when it mattered, a lesson that had arrived too late to prevent the fall, but not too late to be understood.